Hello, welcome to Into the Fire, a Burning Coal Theater Company podcast series.
Hi, this is Jerome Davis. I'm the artistic director of Burning Coal Theater Company, and I'd like to welcome everyone to Into the Fire, the Burning Coal Theater Company podcast series on all things theatrical. Burning Coal is getting ready to do the U.S. premiere of a play by the British playwright David Edgar called Here in America, which deals with, among other things, Arthur Miller, Elia Kazan, Marilyn Monroe, and the McCarthy era. And so we have a very special guest today on the podcast, and that is New York Times writer Clay Risen, who is also the author of the book Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of a Modern America. So Clay, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It is absolutely delightful to talk to somebody who has delved so much into this subject. I'm curious, where did the idea for that book come from? Was that an assignment you were given, or is that something you wanted to do on your own, or how did that happen?
Yeah, no, it was something I wanted to do on my own. I have written a few other books about post-war American history. And one of the things when I was thinking about those books and I was thinking about what I might write next, it occurred to me that even though those books are mostly about civil rights, about urban history in the 1960s, a lot of the way that the stories played out and the politics in those stories was subtly shaped by the events of the Red Scare. There were a lot of politicians who felt that they couldn't do something or had to do something a certain way because they were afraid of being targeted as pro-communist or soft on communists or pinkos or whatever you have. And so it struck me that the Red Scare sort of operated as this almost like a dark matter, like this sort of quality that you couldn't really put your finger on, and very few people actually mentioned, and yet it constrained so much of American life long after it had played out. So that was my first impetus, was to say, well, what is this period, really for myself, just to go learn more about it. And then it occurred to me, or as I found, it had been a while since there was a good book on the Red Scare, that there was a lot to be updated, a lot of new things to say, and that for better or worse, probably for worse, it spoke to our moment in the present as well.
Very, very much so. I couldn't agree more with that. And not just with regard to Russia or communism, but as a tactic. It feels like a kind of open-ended insert your own product method of silencing people really who have things to say that one might not agree with. Question I have for you is when did it start? We think of Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee and early clashes with people like Robert Kennedy and Nixon, people like that. When in your mind did the Red Scare take hold as a placeholder in the American imagination?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a long answer and a short answer, but I'll keep the long answer short. The long answer is that, anti-communism, anti-radicalism had been around for a long time, and it had bustled, sort of bubbled up in the 19th century, again after the end of World War I. But the period that I'm talking about is kind of, a lot of people call this the second Red Scare. It's the one that most people think of when you say Red Scare. And that really began after the end of World War II. And this was a period when Americans were really trying to figure out what happens next, right? The world had gone through a depression, a world war. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were dead. No one knew what came next, and everyone hoped that it would be peaceful. But then suddenly there was this Cold War that set in, and it threw everything into chaos, even more than it already existed. And so out of that, one of the things that grew out of that almost immediately in 1946, I would say, is the Red Scare. That's kind of when I pinpoint it. That's when the House Un-American Activities Committee became a permanent committee
Mhm.
and one with a decent amount of funding, a decent amount of a mandate to go after this broad category, really undefined category of un-American activities.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad category. Were there other activities beyond daring to wear the hammer and sickle that was included in that early on, to your knowledge?
Yeah, well, so the committee actually began in the late 1930s with it was temporary, it had a slightly different mandate, but at the time it was founded largely to go after right-wingers and fascists. This was the time of, a large amount of concern about fascism in the United States, and both with what was going on in Europe and some domestic movements. But it very quickly became hijacked by uh, pretty very conservative forces in the United States, conservative congressmen who turned the lens leftward and used it to go after the New Deal, to go after Franklin Roosevelt, and that was the spirit that maintained. Although really up until the Red Scare, every once in a while there would be a focus on brown shirts, Nazis, pro-Spanish
John
fashion.
Birch Society, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and so that all really fell away with the establishment of the permanent HUAC in 1946. That premise of being even-handed, we're going to look for radicals wherever we find them. 1946, it became very clear that no, we're only going after one particular type.
And that was just coincidentally, right after the war and right after we had been sort of hoisted out of the Depression through what can only be described as socialist means. I think the WPA, the building of, here in Raleigh, we have a community theater that was built during the WPA period, the Raleigh Little Theater, which is still going strong, 80 plus years later. But also things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, I think, which brought electricity to a lot of people, and roads, highways, the interstate system was all coming on in that time. So was this a concerted effort to convince the American public that those types of uses of their tax dollars should not be tolerated? Is that what was
Yeah,
going on, do you think?
I think you can look at it in a couple of ways because it's complicated. I think there was legitimate concern about Soviet espionage in the United States. Even in 1946, there was pretty strong evidence that would turn out to be correct, that the Soviets had extensive spy networks in the United States,
Right.
at least during World War II. There were also legitimate concerns about the Communist Party and how loyal the Communist Party was to the Soviet Union and how much it was facilitating espionage. But what happened, and this is really the argument in my book, is that those specific concerns became kind of a convenient vehicle for ideologues who really had a different target in mind. They were people who, ever since the emergence of the New Deal, ever since the emergence of Franklin Roosevelt, had gone after those structures, those government structures, and also the culture around the New Deal, this kind of progressive, tolerant, cosmopolitan world that Franklin Roosevelt brought in. There were a lot of people who didn't like that, a lot of powerful people. And so they used the excuse of hunting communism, of hunting spies, saboteurs, as an excuse to go after, like you said, all manner of aspects of the New Deal, all manner of aspects of the Roosevelt agenda, to tear them down and kind of take us back to where we had been 15 years earlier.
One of the other things that was happening right around that same time, which I think is not entirely to be dismissed, in the telling of the story is the advent of television, which was a mass medium that looked like perhaps it could exceed even the reach of radio, which up till that time was the way to get into people's hearts and minds. And so I know that one of the things that was pushed was the idea of looking for communists under every rock in Hollywood, and to some degree it spread to New York and to Broadway and off Broadway as well. I guess there was no off Broadway at the time, but Broadway and the playwrights who were then very well known in our country. Did your book look at that aspect at all, or have you done research on that?
Yeah, I talk about it a decent amount. One of the things that happened in the 1930s was Hollywood was fairly well off despite the Depression. People still wanted entertainment, and that was where you went for movies. And so it was this bustling industry, and it attracted thousands of people from the theater world. And, the theater world in the 1930s, especially in New York, but in other places, was pretty progressive, pretty left-wing. And so people brought those values, those ideas to Hollywood. And it's one of the reasons why Hollywood made for a very attractive target for HUAC, was because there were these people who were known to be progressives, left-wingers in Hollywood. And yet then at the same time, as you mentioned, television started coming around by the late 40s and early 50s. People, thousands a day were thousands of units were being sold a day. And yet television was this very, still in its baby steps, and people didn't know how to organize, how to successfully sell television entertainment. And so there's a lot of worry there. And it became a huge battleground for the Red Scare, because a lot of actors from Hollywood and producers and set designers and directors, they all went and worked in television. And television at the time was all sponsored. Each show had a sponsor, Mexico or General Electric. And these companies were incredibly worried about getting a bad name. Right. And so anytime there was even a rumor about an actor or a script writer, they would get pressure from the public, often from sort of grassroots anti-communist organizations for boycotting their products. And so a lot of people who were blacklisted, especially later on, were television people who were blacklisted, even before they actually got to be on TV. Theater, though, was really interesting because it was one of the places where the Red Scare didn't really penetrate, or rather, one of the few entertainment cultural corners of the United States that resisted the Red Scare. The theater industry largely rallied around itself, especially in New York, and resisted the pressure by HUAC and by various self-defined anti-communist organizations, to investigate and to blacklist. There was never really a theater blacklist in the way that there was a TV blacklist, the way that there was a movie blacklist. I'm not saying that they weren't affected. They were. I think the theater industry actually deserves a lot of credit for resisting and not succumbing to the mob.
That's a large part of what Here in America is about. It's about the decision that Arthur Miller made versus the decision that Elia Kazan made, and how it affected their personal, friendship. There's a really fantastic story in that. I don't know if you know the one about the Shorefront film that Arthur Miller intended to write. He had went to Hollywood to pitch it. It was based on his own personal experience of working on the docks, and it was basically on the waterfront before Bud Schulberg wrote On the Waterfront, and they told him, sure, we'll do your movie, but you have to change the mobsters to communists.
Actually, I didn't know that. That's funny.
And
That's
Miller
funny.
said, thanks, but no thanks, and walked away.
Yeah.
And history changed very significantly then.
Sure.
If they had gone along with him on that, yeah, that is very interesting. Do you think the theater uh, resisted because, just to be crass about it, they had less to lose?
Uh,
Um,
yeah, no, I think that's part of it, right? I mean, part of what happened in Hollywood and in television, or a large part of what happened, was pressure from the owners, from the executives, and from the investors and the large corporations that held sway over those industries. Even though there were individual actors and writers and people who name names and did went along with things, by and large, the industry at a rank and file level was pretty hostile to HUAC and all that.
yeah,
But the course of things was shaped by the people with money. They were concerned about how this would play with the public. Theater is a different thing. It's not, you don't, today's Broadway aside, you don't need as much money to put on a play. It's smaller as a sector. People know each other. It also had deep roots, right? Television was a new thing. People didn't
yeah,
really know what television meant, how it worked economically, culturally. Film was not that much older, and Hollywood had changed a lot. And yet theater was this long tradition of being a community. And so, people knew each other, people worked together, people trusted each other or didn't. The theater program, or the theater world, got a lot of support from the New Deal. There was a federal theater project that
yeah,
coincidentally was one of the sort of trophies of HUAC. They managed to get the Federal Theater Project shut down. But it was an amazing, while it existed, it was an amazing program. It funded writers and actors and stagehands, really helped keep the industry alive during the depths of the Depression.
yeah. And some remarkable work came out of it as
Yes.
well. The Odettes is one example of that. Yeah, it's very interesting. Uh, I I asked that question because I see it happening a little bit today as well, and I wanted to ask you in the time we have left, looking at my clock, in the time we have left to talk a little bit about parallels. The one I have been reading about recently is a group of film industry people and television industry people who signed letter uh, criticizing Israel's behavior vis-a-vis Gaza. And one of the studios, I believe it's Paramount, has now decided they're going to blacklist the people who signed that letter, which sounds an awful lot like Senator
Yeah.
McCarthy's gang. But can you talk about modern parallels to McCarthyism?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of parallels. Blacklisting being just one of them. And it's scary to see, you mentioned Paramount. Obviously, that's just one company. We'll see what others do. But, it certainly is a step in the wrong direction. And, to the extent that that works for one company, it's going to work for others. And I think one of the dangers that we have today that we didn't have in the 1940s and 50s is a government that is wholly behind this, right? I mean, you can say what you will about President Truman, President Eisenhower. They were not lefties by any means, but they were not really supportive of the Red Scare either. And there were a lot of people in government who were not. Today, I think it's a very different picture. And I think there's a lot of, particularly from the White House, a lot of support for these kinds of tactics. The White House uses them in their own political forays. There are other tactics. You talk about pure McCarthyism, where it's just a complete absence of truth, or disregard for the truth, a reliance on smear campaigns, a reliance on outright lies, on there was always sort of this shark characteristic about McCarthy where he just moved forward. That was he never dwelled on anything. He just had to keep swimming forward. And so whatever he said, people would come along and say, well, that's not true. You're accusing someone of something they didn't do. And by then he was already on to the next
Yeah.
thing.
That sounds very familiar.
I think we see that a lot today, and it's an acceptable tactic. But yeah, I think you can't not see parallels, and I think one of the frightening things is that I think the Red Scare shows that it can get even worse.
It is particularly interesting given that he himself was the victim of that to some degree afterward, and now he's using it against, for instance, Venezuela. This argument about Venezuela and drugs, and the statistic I've read, I haven't done deep research, but that like 7% of the drugs that come into the United States come from Venezuela, and but for some reason, and it has to do with a socialist being at the helm, so they're screaming communism, and they're tossing in a little drug dealing, as well. And it's quite astonishing to watch it. It almost, there used to be I guess there still is a saying that history is written by the winners, and I guess the basic idea is that if we win, we don't have to tell the truth because we can just declare that what we said was the truth, and that'll be that. Well, this is all very very interesting and good information, Clay. Do you see? The last question I wanted to ask you about this, and thank you very much for your time, by the way. This is wonderful for our little podcast here. And I know many of our audience will enjoy listening to this in advance of seeing the play. The recent results in the New York City mayor's race, which I don't want to put too much emphasis on one way or the other, but that would seem to fairly roundly contradict the direction that things seem to be going in, particularly given his, just out front admission to socialist ideologies. Do you think that's a one-off? Do you think that's a cult of personality, or do you think there really is something in the air that's led us to that point where at least one major city is concerned?
I think it's a mix of both. I think that Mamdani is a exceptionally talented politician, and I think he was able to express himself in terms and in ways that appealed to people, express his political values, because he is a democratic socialist, and to bring that to people who might traditionally have been skeptical of that. He was able to explain why he actually made sense for them, even if they themselves are not democratic socialists. I think that in itself will be hard to replicate. Zoran Mamdanis don't grow on trees, it's pretty rare. But that said, I think that his overwhelming success does show the way for some people in some places to win on a similar appeal. I think that one of the things that when you scrape away all the noise and all the exaggerations on both sides, particularly in the media, about who he is and what he represented, he's a very pragmatic, down-to-earth person who simply said, look, the government can provide solutions. We can provide free buses. We can provide universal childcare younger than we provide. These aren't radical ideas. They're not even anti-capitalist ideas. They're just ideas that embrace the role of government. And he wants to raise taxes to pay for it. Well, that's not particularly radical either. But these things are cast in a way that make it sound more radical than they are. So I think it's up to other people to find the appropriate ways to cast those things that make sense to, those same ideas might work in Topeka, but put in different terms. So it's really up to other politicians to figure that out. But so I hesitate to say that it's a one-off, but it remains to be seen how many people can figure out their own path.
Yeah, that's going to be the key, and how many want to who have the background and the education and the connections, I guess, that Mamdani had. Well, Clay Risen, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate this. By the way, are you related to James at all?
Yeah, we're cousins.
Oh, are you really? Oh, wow,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
journalist family. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wonderful.
We were at the times we overlapped for a while, but he's moved on since then. But yeah, no, we see each other once a year or so.
Red Scare, Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. The author Clay Risen with us today on Into the Fire at Burning Coal Theater Company. Clay, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to reading more from you in the future.
Well, thank you so much, and good luck with the show.
Thank you, but we say break a leg.
Break a leg.
Thanks so much. Take care.
All right, take care.